Great. So I guess to kick off, who has the slide? Want to pop up the slides? Whoever is running the slides.
See, that's me, Troy.
So, thanks. So we're about ready to get started here. So as I mentioned, we have David and Gayle and Sarah here this morning to talk about climate impacts in Casco Bay. So just the first little housekeeping items, you could put the next slide forward, David. I want to talk a bit about some of the things that are going on. One of the things we wanted to highlight first is some high water marks. And one of the things we're trying to do is to, oops.
That slide's at the end, Troy. So I didn't know if you want to go there first or what.
We can come up with it later. Why don't we just get started? If you want to kick it off.
All right, great. Good. So I'll go ahead and get started. And just want to thank Troy and the city of Portland and South Portland and everyone involved in One Climate Future. As a South Portland resident, obviously super excited about everything that we're doing here. You know, I lead the Climate Center here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. We established ourselves about 1.5 years ago for an organization that many of you may know on Commercial Street here, historically doing a lot of work in fisheries science and fisheries management and working to protect and preserve the working waterfront more broadly throughout the Gulf of Maine region. And so I thought I would just kind of start with, as I was putting these slides together, just kind of a new way to kind of distill everything. So if you want to tune out after this slide, that's totally fine, at least for my part of it. But sometimes it can be overwhelming to think about climate change and to think about, what's going on. And I thought I would try to just distill it down into 10 points. And I think the first and most important is to recognize that climate impacts are occurring now. This is no longer a far off distant thing. And it's also relevant to know that, it's affecting all aspects of livelihoods and well-being. And so whether you're, an indigenous fisherman in the Arctic or a coastal property owner in Florida, these things are having an impact on your lives. And there's really the potential, and what we tend to focus on a lot are the negative consequences of climate change, which are obviously going to be felt inequitably across society and across the world. But it's also important to acknowledge that there are going to be, some positive and also unequal consequences from climate change, and we ought to position ourselves to take advantage of those. And we're especially in the mid latitudes where we live. There are going to be some opportunities that come from climate change. We know what the problem, what's causing the problem. We know what the response options are, and so we're sort of, unlike say the early days of COVID, we know what we need to do, and I think that's a really important point to recognize. And acknowledge that uncertainties do remain, and sometimes they're very large uncertainties, as we'll see, say, with sea level rise projections for the end of the century. But importantly, we know enough to act, and I think that's a really important point. And we know that the costs of inaction far outweigh the costs of action. And so if we want to make an economic case about this, we know that there's plenty of literature and research that shows that's the case. So it really just comes down to mustering the will to act on a scale that meets the challenge. And so I just wanted to lay all that out up front. It's a lot of text, but it sort of helps kind of distill everything. And so with that, I'll just kind of pivot to a collection of different climate risks and impacts in Casco Bay. And this first slide kind of highlights what Troy was talking about. That sort of complicated graphic on the left shows, I'll kind of walk you through it. Basically the sea surface temperature anomaly for the Gulf of Maine. So that means how different is it in any given day compared to the long-term average. And so you can see where it's blue, that means it's cooler than the long-term average, and where it's red, it means that it's warmer than the long-term average. And you can basically read this as the year of 1982, 83, 84, and so on. So as you go up this plot, you get to more current times. And so you can see this is 2021 right at the top here. and we didn't quite process all the data yet, but we got it through mid-December. And what you see in these black lines is where we have what we call marine heat waves. And that means where we've had, I believe it's 3 consecutive days where the sea surface temperature anomaly is higher than the 90th percentile of the long-term average. And you guys may recall that in 2012, we had an extraordinarily warm year. And 2021 is looking like it may be even warmer than 2012. We're still processing that data. But what we showed earlier this week, we released our seasonal warming update for the fall of 2021, which for meteorological purposes is September, October, and November. And it showed that it was the warmest fall on record in the Gulf of Maine. And you can see that there was a real almost regime shift about 10 years ago in the Gulf of Maine, and we can talk a little bit about what might be the drivers of that. But why does warming matter? Well, there's a variety of things that warming causes. First, it can lead to deoxygenation, which obviously has implications for the ecology of the region. Leads to stratification of the water, so it can inhibit mixing, which is really important to bring nutrients from the bottom to the surface. It also leads to freshening. Obviously, as we melt more ice on land, that fresh water gets put into the saltwater environments, and so that can have real impacts on circulation and viability. There are phenological and productivity changes, which basically just means that the timing of different aspects of, say, spawning or other ecosystem behaviors can be altered by warming. We're obviously seeing a lot of species shifts. You know, the lobster gets a lot of play, but you're seeing other things move into this region, whether it's long-fin squid or black sea bass. You know, you've seen some work that shows that the northern shrimp have started to move out. And it could also lead to emergent invasives or new pathogens that could have real, that could wreak havoc on really commercially valuable fisheries. Another aspect or risk from climate change is acidification. I think folks recognize that this means, you know, the atmosphere and the ocean, you know, they have a lot of interaction. And so there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but the ocean absorbs about, you know, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that we emit into the atmosphere. And when carbon dioxide gets absorbed by seawater, it leads to carbonic acid and carbonate ions that can decrease the pH of the water, which leads to an increase in the acidification. And so what you see here on the left is NOAA data that shows the pH basically over the past 10 or 12 years in the Gulf of Maine. Part of the reason I show this is to demonstrate that when you look at a smaller geographic scale, sometimes the data is much noisier than if you look at the global average. Okay, so when you average over the globe, you can see a much more defined decline in pH. Part of that is an artifact of the y-axis scale as well. But you can also see that as we look forward into the future, out to the year 2100, there are significant implications for how much acidification we will see based on how much carbon dioxide humanity continues to emit into the atmosphere. And so these are different scenarios. You guys may have seen some of these numbers before, but this is what they call representative concentration pathway 2.6. This basically means that we limit global warming to around roughly 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So it's incredibly aggressive decarbonization. Many folks think it's, many experts don't believe it's still all that practical to achieve that. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have this RCP 8.5, which is, you know, for lack of a better phrase, business as usual, but it means that there's still aggressive growth in carbon dioxide emissions around the world. And you can see the implications of that on ocean acidification levels at the end of the century. And of course, why that's important is because it can really inhibit the, it has a lot of implications for a variety of species, but in particular, it has an impact on shellfish. And This is just one example from an oyster hatchery out in, I think it's in Puget Sound, that shows a one-day-old oyster larvae in favorable conditions and unfavorable conditions, basically from using natural seawater, but as you get deeper into the ocean, you can absorb more CO2 because it's colder. And so if you, as it says here, when that water intake was from deep waters, more acidic waters, you see the inhibition of shell growth, which can have real implications, not just on the viability of wild species, but also on commercially harvested shellfish. Another impact, obviously, is sea level rise. Many of you may have seen these plots before, but these come from the Maine Climate Council Scientific and Technical Subcommittee's report from 2020. You can see the historical observations of sea level rise from the Portland tide gauge. It's increased by about, I think, 9 inches or so since the beginning of the 20th century. And as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how much sea level rise we will see in the future through the rest of this century. Again, largely driven by how much emissions we emit into the atmosphere, but there are also uncertainties associated with how, say, the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets will behave as well. And so you can see that these different scenarios range from about 1.5 feet of additional sea level rise to upwards of 9 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And the Maine Climate Council put forward these kind of 2 broad categories of management regimes: the commit to manage and the prepare to manage piece. And I believe we are one of the few states that have actually enshrined this type of work in law, where we now have, in law, the Department of Environmental Protection has been charged with going back and looking at regulations and other things to see how this level of sea level rise will impact current codes, laws, regulations that are on the books. And obviously, I don't need to tell you all why sea level rise matters. You see it a lot with flooding. You see it with erosion. The Maine Geological Survey is doing some great work trying to demonstrate different types of shoreline buffering capabilities and things like that. Perhaps more insidious is kind of the inundation and salinization aspect. So when you think about freshwater resources and other types of systems that once they get exposed to salt water can really have some challenges. And of course, there's the real human piece of this as well, in terms of displacement and migration that has real issues of equity embedded within them. But also, as you're seeing, in certain parts of southern Maine, a recognition that it may have real economic implications as well for their tax base and for coastal property owners. Another potential impact is on stronger coastal storms. I take this from an S3 story map that GMRI worked on with the city of South Portland, where we looked at a bunch of different sea level rise scenarios and also looked at what storm surge might look like. And these photos were taken from Winter Storm Riley that had a 2-foot storm surge on top of a roughly 11-foot high tide, which is a pretty high tide, which led to, roughly 13-foot storm tide. And you can see, some familiar places, largely nuisance level, you might say at this stage. But I think the kind of eye-opening stat here is that this is similar to what we can expect to experience during high tides, i.e. with no storm, of a sea level rise of a little over 1 foot, or what is basically the equivalent to the commit to manage scenario by 2040, so roughly 20 years from now. So that's pretty stark when you think about that. And so it has real implications for how we manage our coastal infrastructure. Another real impact on Casco Bay are heavier rainfall events. In the Northeast in the US in particular, we are seeing more and more of our precipitation come in heavier rainfall events. And so that obviously has implications for stormwater runoff, for example. And so you can see that this heavy rainfall can lead to runoff that wipes all these nutrients and other pollutants into not just ponds and lakes, but also into the coastal zone. And that can trigger the formation of harmful algal blooms and lead to fish kills. And so that has real implications on certainly tourism and recreational opportunities on these lakes, ponds, and in the coastal zone for sure. And I just want to highlight a few other impacts that I won't talk about as much, but it's important to recognize that, you know, I focused a lot on the bay itself, but in the region broadly, you know, there's a lot of additional impacts that are going to happen across, you know, like I said in the beginning, freshwater resources. Obviously, our state is the most forested state in the nation, and we have real potential implications from climate change on those forest ecosystems, which also translates into implications for agriculture. I'll flag just the public health component as well. You know, the most direct aspect of this probably is in extreme heat. So when we have heat waves in the summertime, we need to think about cooling stations and providing services for at-risk folks in our communities. But as we saw last year, you know, you can have real impacts on air quality. You know, all the wildfires out west contributed a lot of particulate matter or smoke that came over here and can have real implications, not just on the PM in the atmosphere, but also it can create ground level ozone, which is a pollutant for humanity. And of course, the expanded range of different types of pests. You know, the classic example is, you know, the ticks, deer ticks, for example. And so you can have a growing risk of Lyme disease as a result. All this has big implications, as I mentioned, on tourism, recreation, economic growth, your tax base. And there's a growing recognition that, you know, these impacts don't occur in isolation, and that we can have, unfortunately, you know, these compound extreme events where we can have, say, you know, a strong nor'easter followed by, you know, some other type of extreme weather event. One of the classic examples that you look at out west is when you have a wildfire that basically clears off a hillside and then an atmospheric river that dumps a whole bunch of water that can lead to landslides and mudslides that can cut off roads, cut off services to rural communities and things of that sort. So it's really thinking about also multiple stressors on these systems, right? Obviously, climate change is exacerbating a lot of aspects, but you know, development patterns and other decisions certainly have an impact on the systems that we care about. And these impacts can sort of cascade from one another. And so, you know, if you have one particular impact in, say, an ecosystem, let's say on a small copepod or zooplankton in the ocean, that can cascade throughout the food web and have really big implications ultimately on commercial species. And so I just wanted to highlight a few other additional resources if you're interested and you're not aware of them. As part of the One Climate Future work, there was a really well done climate change vulnerability assessment. And at the state level, the University of Maine for the past, since the past, I think 2009, it looks like, every 5 years or so, they've released this Maine's Climate Future report. And as I invoked with the sea level rise plots, the Maine Climate Council released a really comprehensive assessment of climate science and impacts in the state in 2020, and they even provided a really solid update to it last year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gayle to talk a little bit about citizen science and coastal flooding.
Thanks so much, Dave. So a lot of that information can be really overwhelming, and then oftentimes we're left with, well, what is it that we can do? And we can all do something. There's lots of ways to contribute towards identifying kind of what those next steps are. What are the possible solutions that we can take in our own communities to mitigate or adapt to these climate impacts. But in order to take a lot of those steps, we need data. And we need a lot of data on a really local level, and more data than we can get from the sensors that are out there, and more data than we can get from the scientists that are in the labs. And that's where citizen science comes into play. And how can we as a community get out there and collect a lot of this data to help inform these decisions on a really local level for our communities in order to adapt to rising seas. So the Gulf of Maine Research Institute partnered with Portland and South Portland, as well as a few other communities in the Gulf of Maine, and we're excited to be expanding this year as well. This past year, we've really piloted this project. We've identified coastal flood monitoring sites within Portland and South Portland. These are areas of high interest for the cities. They're areas that are accessible to the public, that are vulnerable to sea level rise today. And we're really encouraging folks to get out and to make observations, take photos of these sites. It doesn't have to happen during a high water event like you see here in this photo. It could also be evidence of flooding, which could be perhaps seaweed or whatnot that's washed up by a high tide or a storm. But really we're wanting to understand what water level and weather conditions lead to local flooding. So we're still working to roll out water level monitoring devices at these locations to get some more increased data. But we're really excited about the engagement in this project over the past year. But we also recognize that there's flooding and water impacts happening at a lot more places than these coastal flood monitoring sites. So we're really excited about the work that Friends of Casco Bay is doing. So I'm going to pass things over to Sarah.
Thanks, Gail, and thanks all for having Friends of Casco Bay here today. So similarly, we at Friends of Casco Bay have a program that we call Water Reporter, where we're also encouraging volunteers to collect observational data. The questions that we're looking at are a little bit different, and it's how healthy is Casco Bay? How is Casco Bay changing? So while our volunteers are using their smartphone to photograph evidence of sea level rise, like you see in this one post here, which is at South Portland, the steps down at Spring Point, they're also documenting other things like pollution, signs of pollution, or nuisance algal blooms, which are an indicator of nitrogen pollution, and marine debris, other things. And since 2018, when we launched this, the photographs have really helped us do things like advocate for the sea level rise bill that Dave was talking about, that is requiring state agencies to consider how our coast will look in the future and plan for that and the decisions that are being made now. It's also done other things as well that I can talk about, like investigate sources of pollution. And so for this effort, you can take part anywhere in Casco Bay. Of course, if you are at one of the Portland or South Portland coastal flood monitoring sites, we want you to take part in the GMRI's effort, but anywhere else in Casco Bay. And if you're not documenting sea level rise, we would love for you to take part in Water Reporter. And so Troy, I think I'm passing it over to you to talk about the high water marks. And Troy, I think.
Unmute. There. Sorry about that. Thanks, everyone. So yes, in line with kind of the educational piece, getting the word out about the impacts of sea level rise. We see pictures in some of our presentations, but we've worked really, both Portland and South Portland teams have worked really closely with partners, the Army Corps of Engineers, a group of state and federal and local employees called the Silver Jackets group, to try to get some of these high watermark signs noted around our waterfronts. And we note kind of the high watermark is benchmarked on what was historically our highest storm surge, which was the blizzard of 1978, which is kind of a good demonstration of where we might see sea level rises in the future. And so we certainly invite everybody to go and take a look at those around the cities. You can see them in Portland on the Four River Trail, on Back Cove, Eastern Prom Trail, and there's one right down on the waterfront over near Jay's Oyster. So right there, if you're down and enjoying yourselves in the old port, go check that out. In South Portland, they're at Mill Creek, Bug Light, and at Willard Beach. And definitely want to give a shout out to some of our city staff who work closely. Kevin Denault, who I think he just posted a link, but Kevin's an expert map person, and we really rely on Kevin and the GIS team to help us understand on a visual scale with our mapping technology how sea level rise will impact us in the future. So definitely have a look at those high water marks. And that's
Great.
what I have on.
Thanks, Troy. I think that is all of the slides we have. So I'm going to stop my share so we can all see each other again. I think we have a good amount of time for questions, comments, reactions.
Yeah, that's great. That's a perfect length of presentation, because one of our goals certainly with coffees and climates are to have actual conversation, and so lots to digest in our presentation this morning, and so happy to open the floor here to anyone with questions, or a good opportunity to talk to some real experts here in the room too. If you have any particular questions or want to dive more into the data or what we think might be coming in the future. So don't be shy. If you have a question, just hop right on, and you either can just unmute and ask your question or raise your hand. Or so I'll kick it. I have a question. I mentioned kind of the new science, David. Can you you did a little bit of presentation about the warming. Can you maybe go a little bit more into the data? Like what types of temperatures are we seeing? Are we how much warmer is it? And is it something that we actually even notice ourselves as people who might be boaters or swimmers in Casco Bay?
You may. I don't know how. I don't go swimming all that much in the bay, but it was, I think, upwards for, I think, at least one day it was 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it normally is, which is, I like to think about it as kind of like the human body, right? I mean, when you talk about, well, is really 1 or 2 degrees that much of a problem for the Earth system? Well, if you have a 1 or 2 degree fever, you're not feeling great. If you have a 4 or 5 degree fever, you're feeling really lousy, and some of your systems start to shut down. And that's kind of how you can think about the Earth system as well. And so for the Gulf to experience a day, at least that was 6 degrees above normal, was pretty dramatic. I think it stayed around 60 degrees Fahrenheit through almost the entire month of October, which is just extraordinary. So if you talk to fishermen who are out there all the time, they'll come back and they were saying, it's remarkable. It's remarkable out there. It's warmer out there than it is on land. I mean, it really was just unusually warm, and that warmth just kind of persisted throughout the entire year. So it's and I think from kind of a climatological standpoint, you saw this week, NASA, NOAA, the Japanese Meteorological Agency, the European Copernicus, all they released their sort of annual rankings of global temperature, which include both land and ocean. And it ranged somewhere between the 5th and 7th warmest year on record. And the part of the reason why that is so notable is that it was a La Nina year too. And so La Nina years tend to be somewhat cooler. And so it was the warmest La Nina year on record. And so, you're going to continue to have these oscillations driven by things like El Nino and La Nina and things of that sort. But the trend is unmistakable, and frankly, the rate of change is what we really need to concern ourselves with, because systems just don't have time to adapt.
Yeah, totally. When you showed the graph there, it showed the year on year, and it just got redder and redder and redder as we got towards the current year. And the reason that I kind of personally I did notice it. I was paddling late into the fall this year, and popping out of the boat into the water. It was like literally the water was often warmer than the air, which was really crazy to me. It seemed really nutty.
Troy,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add, we heard that a lot from our members this year that do, we have people who go in every week all year long, and they were reporting feeling the warmth in their day-to-day.
Yeah, it was crazy. Do have a question from Sarah asking about some of the adjustments maybe that we're already making in the city of Portland related to sea level rise. And so we actually are. A few years ago, we actually had to start protocols for flooding in Bayside. So if you go down and if you go down into near Whole Foods or Kennebec Street and some of those places, at an astronomical high tide, you don't want to park there because literally seawater will come up and get your car all rusty in the future. So we actually have our team, our public works team, watches tide charts and tide predictions, and on moments when we expect an astronomical high tide or some sort of storm surge, we pull out the barricades and signs and try to keep people from parking in those low-lying areas that are going to be impacted. And that was something we literally had to institute just a few years ago. So we really do see the impacts already happening, and now we're seeing it more and more often on the waterfront too. So if you, again, king tides and other storm events, you'll see the public works team go down and block off the road to Portland Pier because we don't want people to drive down there or park at the end of the pier and be stuck when water covers up the egress. So yeah, it is actually really is happening, and we're noticing it's happening more quickly now. So who else has
I
questions?
see Alan has his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I think you're muted, Alan.
Apparently, the Gulf of Maine has both a higher temperature rise than most of the ocean and higher sea level than most of the ocean. And I just wonder what is causing that? Why is Gulf of Maine so different in that way?
It's a great question. So on the warming front, you're right. Research at GMRI has shown that we are warming right now, at least roughly faster than 96% of the rest of the global ocean. We're going to do an end of year assessment in the next couple of weeks that will update that number. The reason for that is a big part of the reason is the changes in the Gulf Stream. And so the Gulf Stream, right, is that big current that comes up the Atlantic coast of the US, brings a lot of heat from the tropics into the mid latitudes. And what we're seeing is that the Gulf Stream itself is, historically it's been, there's a lot of variability in it, but it tends to be a very constrained, kind of stream of water, for lack of a better phrase. And so I like to think about a garden hose where it's on the jet setting, right? And over time, it is almost shifted into more of the shower setting. And so what that means is that the warmth and the warm water can spill over Georges Bank in the Northeast Channel a little bit more. And so we're getting more and more of that warmth in the Gulf of Maine. Another part of the reason is that the Gulf of Maine, by definition, is a gulf, right? And so it's sort of a large kind of cut off basin of sorts. And it's, compared to the rest of the ocean, it's relatively shallow. And so you can heat up a shallow body of water much more quickly than you can a deeper body of water. So those are two of the big reasons why the warmth has happened. On the sea level rise, you're right. There's, sea level kind of varies around the world depending on a variety of factors, including kind of tectonic activity, including the amount of land subsidence that can be either natural or human induced. If you're taking out a lot of groundwater in the coastal zone, or say oil and gas, you're kind of compressing that sponge a little bit. And so the highest rates of sea level rise tend to be in the Gulf of Mexico, and you see that obviously in the Mississippi Delta in particular. But the entire East Coast is seeing greater than global average sea level rise rates for a variety of factors. that include some tectonic activity, but also I think some ice sheet activity too. So if you look at a map of this, I don't know if I have it I don't have it in my backup slides, but the Gulf of Alaska, for example, has much lower than global average sea level rise. And part of the reason for that, I'm getting a little bit outside of my lane here, but is changes in sort of what they call glacial rebound and other factors that kind of allow the land to bounce back, so to speak. So there's point being that there's a lot of variability around the world. And unfortunately, some of the most vulnerable places are also some of the places, and when I say vulnerable, I mean lowest capacity, least resourced, and greatest exposure have the greatest rates of sea level rise.
Well, we have a question from Nick. Nick, you have your hand up. You want to chime in?
Yeah, I walk my dog down on Willard Beach every morning, and I appreciate that the sign there, but I also look around both sides of the Willow Street entrance there, and there's a lot of houses in that zone that would have been knee deep. And what's the current thinking at the Portland and South Portland levels, at least municipal levels, about relocation out of the flood zone? Is there work on that yet?
So I can represent Portland, and we have a little bit. We don't have quite as much housing on the waterfront or as South Portland might have, but in general, that's a conversation we really haven't had in depth. One of the recommendations in One Climate Future is talking about developing climate resilience overlay zones to really impact what can happen in vulnerable parts of the city. So we've broached that topic with the planning board a little bit already. It's something that we really want to advance a lot more vigorously over the next year or so to really have that conversation to think about development and how it happens. But in terms of relocating, that's a big topic. I mean, Portland, a lot of the properties that are most vulnerable are commercial. A lot of marine industry things, which in some ways is probably better because folks who work on the water are more accustomed to dealing with changing seas and storm surges. So I hope, I'm thinking, and we were kind of chatting before we kicked off this morning, that, hopefully there's an opportunity for, the development community and city government to learn from the experiences of marine industries and how to be adaptable to water. I think there's a lot to learn there. I mean, things that industries and uses that are able to get wet and adapt, to get, have some sea level rise or storm surge come in and impact them, and the water goes away and they can go back to business. Those are the types of things I think we want to think about. How do we prioritize adaptable and resilient uses on the waterfront? Is kind of how I'm thinking about it. And let's see, I think we had another question too. I think it was Karen had a question about commitment to climate action here in Portland and South Portland. And I'd say it's building, certainly. I mean, we have our city councils have passed some great policy objectives. We want to, we declare a climate emergency. We have One Climate Future, and we've done a lot of great groundwork to make progress, and really starting in. And I think one of the most significant things on the Portland side that is happening is we're literally rewriting the land use code for the whole city about how development happens, and that's really going to be really influential on how we move forward. One Climate Future talks, and also Portland's comprehensive plan talks about building walkable, complete neighborhoods, and for that to happen, we need to adjust our rules about how we develop, and so the land use code is how that happens. And so right now we have recode in process, first time to reevaluate our land use policy in a generation. And the objective is to make our land use policies align with One Climate Future and Plan 2030. So the planning department's actively seeking comment about that currently. So if you went to the city webpage and found planning department or recode, just look for recode. If you even Google recode, you can find it, and you can learn more about that. but in terms of other efforts, we're working really hard on new renewable energy. Portland has signed up with solar projects around the state for about 75% of our electricity. Certainly more to come, but that's our goal. We're going to be pushing really hard on electrify everything. Our goal is to try to get everybody to move towards electric everything and powered by renewable energy. So a lot to come. And really encouraged. The city council noted that climate change is and climate action is one of their priorities this year. And so they're just stay tuned to that work, and certainly invite everyone to stay close to the Sustainability and Transportation Committee. And and Councilor Zaro is the chair, and certainly let him know how you feel about things, and let's make some progress. So let's see.
Or can I just add a bit to that one too?
Absolutely. Sure.
Thanks. So Dave alluded to some of the work that the state has done with Maine Won't Wait document and some of those resources. But just recently, I think in December, they launched, or the government's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future launched a climate resilience partnerships program for all communities in Maine to receive funds to either support them in understanding their climate vulnerabilities and to kind of declare that climate is a priority for those communities, and then also to support resilience actions, whether that's mitigation on renewable energies or adaptation to climate impacts. They have a whole list of actions that they're supporting. So it's a really great new funding program, funding being a really key thing that the state has rolled out. And it's really just getting started. So I'm excited to see where that goes, especially to support communities that don't have all of the amazing resources that Portland does have.
And just kind of on that note, one of the requirements for participating in the state's new program was to have the cities and towns who want to participate do a community resilience self-assessment program. And so a group of city staff and I convened to kind of go over, how are we doing with resilience in Portland? And we presented that at the Sustainability and Transportation Committee last week. And I think it was a great exercise. We noted that there are a lot of things that we're doing pretty well, but there's definitely things we need to improve on, particularly on getting, some of the resilience features and goals into policy. So when we have development, when we have people who want to build things, our development review teams and the planning board actually have policy tools to require resilience to actually happen. So it's definitely a missing link so far as getting our actual, legislative and ordinance requirements up to the standard of what we talk about in our vision documents. So that's really a big area we're going to be working on for sure. And let's see, Lauren's question, kind of piggybacking on Karen, and we talked a little bit about it. But how do we engage? And I think staying close to our city councilors. They represent community members, and so there's opportunities. You can certainly contact them by email. And again, the Sustainability and Transportation Committee has oversight over the One Climate Future Plan and meets at least once a month, and often takes public comment about things. So we post the agendas on the website, and we're trying to make sure we alert people about the upcoming meetings on social media as well, so you can see what's going on and have some of the issues and offer some public comment. And I know we had some great public comment at the meeting last week about our resilience self-assessment. So I think that's the best way to stay engaged and stay tuned to the policymakers, and you can let them know how you feel about climate action. If there's anything you want to suggest, you certainly can reach out to our offices, our Portland and South Portland sustainability offices. We're really always happy to hear comments and feedback and suggestions from members of the public. So let's see, more questions. This one from Dana. Maybe good, maybe for Sarah, about as small scale aquaculture farmers, is there anything we can do to help with data collection?
Yeah, this observational data is really valuable. So some people, when they say data collection, they're thinking about measuring temperature, dissolved oxygen, or things like that. but the value of the photos that are taken and the descriptions of the changes that are occurring is just as valuable, because there's some things that we can't measure easily. And so having those photos, having those descriptions are really helpful. So with you being out on the water all the time, out on the bay all the time, you're going to see things that others aren't going to see, and having an understanding of that. So it might be this year looks different than last year in this way, or it might be suddenly this other thing has happened. And so you know best the changes that you're seeing. And so that's what I encourage you to do, is to notice those changes, document them, and then we will come to you and ask for additional information when it's needed, and see what we can do with that information when it's necessary.
And if I could just piggyback on that, Dana, Sarah made a number of good points, and I think increasingly, we're thinking about how can we, leverage the fact that you all are on the water regularly to do things like, identification of newly emergent species and things of that sort. And so there's we've been toying around internally with whether we can, work with you all to get water samples for eDNA to not only help potentially find, harmful pathogens to you, but also to see if there are other changes afoot. So we'll probably like to follow up with you if that's okay.
That sounds great. We're looking into doing some green crab stuff this year too, so that would be a fun,
fantastic,
added
great
bonus on the side. Thank
Great.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
See, new hand up, Martin, MJ Martin. You could jump right in.
Hey folks, I don't know if you can hear me or see me or what, but
We can hear you. Yep.
okay. My name is Max. I'm actually new at the city. I'm in the planning department. To be continued. Hosting a little bit of a internal meeting on some of these topics for us and stuff. So it's nice to, rub shoulders virtually here. My question though would be, what considerations have been given to things like green infrastructure versus, say, like a hard natural seawall? I was part of, in Boston where I did my master's stuff. That was a lot of the discussion. I'm wondering, to what extent does Portland look at other cities? And, those can be kind of interesting topics, but that's kind of what I was curious if there's any discussion on that these days.
Yeah, that's a great point, Max. So I think green infrastructure is going to be really important for moving forward. Our water resources team is definitely looking at that. How do we manage stormwater, particularly without having to, build more sewer pipes and do more hard, gray infrastructure. But also, one of the things we note is, we need places for marshes to retreat. How can we use our water edges to help us adapt to sea level rise, but also protect, habitats that are really threatened by sea level rise. In Portland, certainly we have a lot of areas that are already pretty hardened, and it will be difficult to convert to marsh space, but we have a lot of opportunity at the same time. So I know a lot of thoughts going into, like, how can we look at having more natural soft edges, particularly in like the Back Cove area. I think there's a lot of opportunity over there, and particularly in places that look up in the Fore River, where we have some protected lands already, that maybe this opportunity to have marsh, places for marshes to migrate there as well. But certainly we do look at other examples, and I think those are definitely influencing some of our thought moving forward. And we talk about that a lot in One Climate Future, the way, as a way to mitigate climate change and sea level rise, because certainly the natural edges are important in reducing heat island effects too. One of our goals is to really reduce impervious surfaces, to both for stormwater management, but also to just keep the heat down. So those are certainly great considerations.
Can I follow up on that, Troy?
Yeah, please do, Matt. Please do, Gail.
The Greater Portland Council of Governments, or GPCOG, just received a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. GMRI is a partner on that grant, with a focus to work with I think it's 10 Casco Bay communities or Cumberland County coastal communities on identifying where are nature-based solutions going to be kind of a best option, or where are they possible, I guess, within each of those communities, to prioritize for adaptation options, and really looking at a regional approach with that. So we're really excited to roll out that project this year. We just received news of that award late last year. So more to come.
And
Kind of on that. Oh,
I was
go
going
ahead.
to add one more thing too. There's around the Bay, there are other partners like Casco Bay Estuary Partnership who are already doing experimental projects. And I know there's other partners on that too, but I can't properly identify them. So I'm sorry about that. But those are happening in places like Brunswick, which are good learning that can be applied in these other areas.
Kind of, on that note, I'm wondering, maybe Sarah, it's a good question for you. But in terms of how does stormwater coming in from the cities, Portland, South Portland, and other neighboring communities, what kind of negative impacts does stormwater have on Casco Bay?
Yeah, stormwater's a really important factor because of the pollutants, which has already been talked about, the pollutants that get washed in, and then how that changes the chemistry in the bay. Also, there can be so much fresh water that sits up on the bay, and Dave was talking earlier about stratification in the water column. It's not on the same level that you're talking about when you're talking about the whole Gulf, but it does have an impact. You can actually see, say, if you're on the Eastern Prom and you look out, you can actually see brown water sitting on top of the bay after really heavy rainstorm. And so it is important, especially when you're thinking about nutrients and sediments that are being washed into the bay.
Yeah, and so and also it leads to more fresh water, but also, as you mentioned, the nutrients which cause problems. I think you guys are monitoring algal blooms, I think,
Yes.
on the waterfront and Bat Cove, other coasts, which those certainly have negative impacts as well.
Right. So yeah, one of the key sub projects for our water reporter volunteers is tracking those nuisance algal blooms. That's the green mats. People used to call it green slime, that kind of can sit on top of mud flats. And when it gets really, really dense, it sits on top of the mud, and you can actually see it at low tide, and it actually kind of takes all the oxygen out of the mud underneath. And you can actually, if you pick it up, you can see like dead clams underneath. And so those slimes, like you were saying, Trey, that's an indication of too much nitrogen in the water. And so what's great about tracking those, like we have seen them in Back Cove before, we haven't as much in recent years, which is good. But we see them in places like Pleasantdale Cove in South Portland, or sometimes at Willard Beach. And we then work with the Department of Environmental Protection to both understand why that's happening, and with the local municipalities too, to understand why that's happening. And right now there are conversations about setting nitrogen criteria limits, which could have a really positive impact for the bay. Yeah, it's important.
And that and that's an area where Portland and South Portland are doing a lot of work too. So in South Portland, we both have pet ordinances restricting the use of pesticides. In South Portland, they have also added restriction on use of fertilizers that will help reduce that nutrient load on the bay. And I think in Portland, we're still looking at adding the fertilizer ordinance to our land care package as well. So that's if that's something that you're interested in, feedback to the council about that would be of interest to them as well. So we're got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to ask one last question. And I'm not sure who was, maybe Gail, in terms of the pH changes. You know, we saw back, David showed the graph of showing the pH, and it's going, you know, if you look at the scale, it doesn't look that bad, but why, you know, how bad is it? Is it, you know, how much worse is it getting in terms of acidification? I don't know who, maybe David or Gayle or.
I'm going to punt that one to Dave.
Yeah, I have to plead a little degree of ignorance. I don't know how bad it's getting here compared to other places. Generally speaking, you know, acidification tends to happen more quickly in cold water environments. So you know, the higher latitude places are probably experiencing a bit more. I think there's definitely cases where you're seeing some problems. I know, for example, over, you know, the example I showed was from I think somewhere in Puget Sound, as I mentioned, up in the Northwest, and over there they have a very different, you know, land water interface, right? We have a long continental shelf here, obviously with the Gulf as well. There it's much different, and so there can be kind of oceanographic changes, current changes that either sort of accelerate upwelling and bring more acidic water to the surface, or the opposite, where, you know, you get more of that stratification. And so there are, in some sense, potentially either indirect or not necessarily climate-driven changes that can really have a big influence on localized acidification. And I think that's an ongoing area of research. The University of New Hampshire has a coastal carbon group that is really active in this space. There's a professor there named Joe Salisbury who's been really on the leading edge of a lot of that work.
Great, thanks. So it's just hit 10 o'clock, and we always try to stay on time, but this has been a fantastic conversation. So Casey, great job of helping. Casey's kind of our lead organizer this morning, so hats off, Casey. Thanks for your work on putting this together. And I certainly want to thank our speakers, David and Sarah and Gayle. And again, we do these events on the second Friday of every month. We try to have something that's of great interest to folks, and I think we're usually reasonably successful. And definitely, we could have this event multiple times. There's lots to talk about, but hopefully you will join us next time, and hope everyone has a great day. All right, take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.